Welcome to our second project using clear epoxy staves in a tangential arrangement. In this project, we'll be using this magnetic levitation module. We'll put it into a blank left from our first project. We'll be powering up this module with 12 volts, which will also power the second module, which is a wireless charger. We'll intercept the power through this induction coil hooked to lights, producing light in our orb. That'll sit on top of this magnet. That magnet will be in these staves producing our orb. Yeah. While testing our equipment for operation, it was noticed that the induction coil had to be raised up above the levitation magnet in order to intercept voltage. We'll need to make a riser for this. So first things first, we are going to glue up all these epoxy staves to form our orb blank. We're going to use a 1-to-1 epoxy glue for this. This gives us an hour of working time, 24 hours cure time. We'll apply the epoxy with a squeeze bottle and a silicone spatula to evenly distribute the epoxy. If you want to see how these staves are made, I would suggest looking at my first video, Woodturning epoxy staves. Once these staves are all applied into our hose clamps in the correct order, we'll snug the hose clamps up, allowing us to freely move the blank around without it falling apart. Here comes the press and the magic. There are 24 staves here cut at 14 degrees, giving us 336 degrees, short of a full sixth circle, which is 360 degrees. This leaves us a gap on the outside, but when we twist it, it lays them over on each other, closing up that gap. This also forms a cone on the inside. By placing a cone and a ball in there, the ball keeps the cone shape. A second cone on the top will center up the blank in our press. And here we are, all pressed down, a coarse set of hose clamps, and cure time to be set in 24 hours. And on to our second glue up for this project. Some Purple Heart put onto some sacrificial blocks to eventually make our plugs. So this is the separation of our blank from our first project. We're going to use this blank to make two pieces on our current project. It's going to make our base, which is going to hold both modules, and it's also going to make the stand, which will hold the orb when it's not in use. And onto the lathe with this blank for us. First thing we're going to want to do is make a dovetail mortise in here so we can flip it around and get rid of that sacrificial block for our first project. Once all this dug fur is dug out, we're going to want to make a step that'll be vertical and include the tabs for our LEDs on our magnetic levitation module. We also want it to be vertical so that we can have no problem with the power port being on the side. Once that is established, we'll want to step that in one more time to accept both modules. In this area, we'll put a dovetail that we can flip this around and finish the top. Once we like everything on the inside, we'll go ahead and separate it from our future stand. Concentrating on the base for now, when we get these two pieces separated, we'll flip the base around and remount onto a 3-inch jaw. Once we get it mounted, we'll true up our plug hole, and that'll lead us on to making a plug for that hole. Here on final sizing of our plug, you can see a stop collar being left. This will prevent over insertion into the base, and that would invade on all of our components, which would be critical. Once we get this plug brought down super thin so we can maximize levitation off of it, we'll want to drill a hole for our power port. I used a Forstner bit in here, and I'll probably be resharpening this bit as I did hit my chuck. Donk. Now we get to put all the guts into this base. Here you can see one module in place in our power port. Here comes another module. And then once we get this in here, we're going to check operation, and then we're going to put an epoxy clear coat over everything. And this will protect both the equipment and the operator. Speaking of which, this device does use electromagnets, so if you had any kind of medical device that would interrupt, this is not something you want to be around. Now that we got a functional base, we're ready to move on to phase 2 of making our orb. First, we're going to strip our blank out of this form. Gave me a little trouble there, but thanks to parchment paper, we broke her out of there. And out pops the cone, and away we go. We're going to take this layer of glue off the inside, exposing bare wood. This way we can hot glue our sacrificial block to the inside. Right now, this blank for our orb weighs a total of 1,300 grams. Our levitation module is only going to support 500 grams. So we're going to have to remove a lot of material here. We are now going to mark out for our tenon to be made on the top of our orb. This way we can flip it around and hollow out the inside. We're also going to mark out the center line. And we're going to give this a little bit of shape after we make our tenon. Flip it around and hollow her out. Before moving on to our plug on the bottom of this, our plug hole will include a dovetail so we can flip it around and remove the tenon off the top later. Also, we'll have a little collar on the inside for the plug to stop against. So we're going to leave this orb chucked up just the way it is. That way, after we get this plug formed, we can dry fit and shape it to the bottom of the orb. Being that this is a dry fit and shaping, when we pull the tailstock away, we'll use some vinyl tape to hold this plug in place while we do a final shaping on the bottom. Here you can see the dovetail mortise that we'll be flipping this around on. Also the stop for our plug. Our orb now weighs 220 grams. And right about now I'm thinking to myself, are you really in that much of a hurry that you're not going to bring your tailstock up? Serious? Well, it wasn't a total failure or a catastrophe. We ended up with a crack and blew out a couple of chunks on our mortise, but we're going to persevere. Some CA glue, hose clamp, bunch of electrical tape, and of course we're going to bring up the tailstock this time. We're going to finish shaping the top of this orb and press on. Here I'm a little gun shy after the recent jump off the lathe, but we finish her up. Once we're happy with the shape of the orb, we're going to move on to the components. We're going to use a triangle chunk of this clear epoxy from a previous project to use as the riser above our levitation magnet to our induction coil and LED. I'm coating this chunk also with the epoxy glue to act as a top coat and clarifier, giving it the illusion that it's kind of floating in the orb. Once we like placement of all these components, we'll set it aside to cure. We're using a 1 minute epoxy here, so cure time is 1 hour. We can move on to gluing this into the orb here really shortly. There you go. When we get this glued in, you'll notice the chip out from our mortise that happened when it jumped off the lathe. To address this, we're going to simply do an epoxy fill, sand down, and hopefully it won't be so noticeable. Remember this piece that we separated the base from? This is going to be the stand for our orb. Before we took it off of the lathe, I put a dovetail mortise in the bottom for when the orb was finished, we could shape the top of it to the bottom of the orb. The reason why we're making a stand is when It's not in operation. It gives the orb a place to sit. Being that there's a magnet in the bottom of the orb and it's round, it doesn't sit by itself really well. And since there's a magnet in the base, it doesn't store really good on top of the base. And I think it looks pretty sharp. And with a finish coat on our stand, we can call this project complete. Thank you folks for all checking this out, and you all be safe out there. The only thing left to do is to play around with this a little bit.